Chapter 7, AEROGREEN, Part 2. Gabriel's limp had worsened as the long march continued, but he said nothing about it. Distant thunder from the north kept them moving at a brisk pace, tired and apprehensive. The trail widened as it crossed a broad, flat, featureless meadow. All the tall, straight pines disappeared behind them, and ahead in their stead loomed large, twisted ords pines. These unusual evergreens bore very long, dark needles, a corky, umber-colored bark, and pulpy cones. They were covered with hanging lichens and parasitic tree eels that dangled like decorative ornaments from the twisting branches. Beyond the trees, dark, jagged rocks jutted up like watchful giants, boulders bordering the corners of the nearby hills. As they drew closer and entered the trees, a large population of shaggy gray squirrels took turns dashing in and out of the large community nests that they had made from the long, thin ords, needles, and thick olive green moss. With eager curiosity, they watched the troop pass by underneath them. They chattered with short barks and whipped their fluffy white tails threateningly. Ott said something in passing about squirrel meat, but the crew hurried on without stopping. The ground beneath the trees was covered with debris from the trees, but the trail, for the most part, was clear and dry. Still, they had often found themselves dodging muddy water holes. As Dreher had predicted, the moths became more abundant as the day wore on. They danced hither and thither in the trees and in the tangles of the underbrush along the trail sides. They fluttered gaily in the air all around them, the males chasing the females in an aggressive courtship ritual. "How much further until Long Gray Bluffs?" Day asked as the trail took a hard turn, heading up a steep embankment. "This road has been heading uphill since we began today. I need a rest. My legs are burning, and these moths are more than I can bear." 4 more days, Dreher said. 3 if we rise a few hours before dawn each morning and press a bit harder before camp each night. Long Gray Bluffs is a small town, not much more than a busy crossroads of sorts, really, run by a rich old tyrant and his sons. I don't know how much luck we'll have when we get there. I haven't seen the old coot in 30 years, but he hasn't known as the friendliest host in the Galgarai even then. "Well, we can negotiate with him, I'm sure," Binder mumbled. "I think we could be a fairly persuasive team if we all set our minds to it." A soft thunder rumbled continuously in the distance. Ott shook himself like a dog shaking off water. Moths flew from his fur like a cloud of gray dust. He roared in anger. "Pestilence," he growled. "They're nesting in my fur." "Yes, these moths are called aerodares," Dreher told them. "Gray aerodares." "Aerodares," Gabriel said. "I fear I know what fate soon awaits us if the aerodares here are like the aerodares of my own country." Dreher acknowledged him with a respectful nod. "I'm afraid they are. As I suspected, this road does indeed lead through AEROGREEN, their breeding ground. I'm not exactly sure if they are in season, but I have a feeling we're going to time it just about right. Wrong." "Well, then we'd best travel through AEROGREEN by day if we can," Gabriel said. "If they're nocturnal, like the red aerodares in Berja, they should be a bit more docile and complacent in the sun's light." "More docile? Moths? How dangerous could they be?" Day asked. "They're just moths." "I've always strived to avoid AEROGREEN when hunting around in this land," Gabriel answered. "Well, there's a story of an entire brigade that was wiped out in this cursed valley." "By moths?" Ott growled. "AEROGREEN can be a very dangerous place," Dreher continued. "The moths have an effect on those who cross their sacred valley. They can be completely overpowering and sometimes even devastating. They somehow can collectively alter one's mind in both fascinating and horrible ways that I cannot wholly describe. I myself have been through this valley once, though it was a long time ago, during midwinter when their numbers were small, and still, it was not an enjoyable experience. But yet, even still to this day, I deeply crave that magical hypnosis again. Once you cross AEROGREEN, you will never be the same again. You will always want to go back there, submerge yourself again in the pain and pleasure that it offers. You will be haunted by that desire of comfort and welcome doom your entire life thereafter. It is like knowing the inevitable peace of death without any more fear of it. Well, I don't care for the sound of that at all, Day responded. Can't we find another way, Binder suggested? Let's go around to the north. On foot, it would add more than a week to our schedule, maybe 2, and that is if you have cliff clingers carrying you, which we don't. You can see the cliff walls from here, Dreher told them, pointing. The gray walls were sheer and featureless, and there are no supply stores along that route. Barren, at best. To the south, the Ord's pines are so dense and tangled that no road has ever been cleared through them, blanketing the hills and valleys for hundreds of miles in all directions, and beyond those pines is yet another wall of rock that nearly equals the cliffs of the Great Galoth Rock. And again, slip pickings as far as hunting for food. No, unfortunately for us, without Skycraft, the road through AEROGREEN is the only road forward. We should be safe enough if we stay on the path and hold ourselves together, Gabriel said. It is navigable. After that, this road was made by men, and it does pass straight through the Valley of the Moths. Dreher agreed. Most mishaps are caused by travelers who advance into the swarm foolhardily. Since we know what to expect somewhat, we should be able to pass safely and quickly if we keep our heads. Now listen closely. Here's what I know of the place. AEROGREEN is a vast, bowl-shaped valley with a long and sordid history, he began. Our road crosses it west to east. There is a deep green stream that enters the vale from out of the root walls of the impenetrable Ord's pine forest to the north, an AEROGREEN river run. It churns through the cliff drain of the valley, through twisting rapids and waterfalls, intersecting our road over a wide, shallow ford, crossable by foot. Then the river run continues its way downstream from there and eventually exits AEROGREEN over a great waterfall some distance directly south over an immeasurable cliff. Now, be prepared. The water of AEROGREEN is icy cold and filled with the aquatic aerodare eggs and caterpillar larvae. Although the miles were so thick during my first journey that I could barely see the stream at all, the aerodares breed along the banks, billions of them, so thick that it is nearly a solid mass. And when the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat their way up the banks towards the Ord's pines where they cocoon. And there they hatch as aerodares, and the cycle continues. When we reach the stream, we'll be blind. But at least you'll know that we are halfway through the AEROGREEN Valley, so keep your head. Hold fast to your concentration. Don't get distracted, and we should be able to make it to the other side in less than an hour from the time we head down into it. What's going to happen to us down in there? Day asked. I can't entirely remember what effect the moths had on me when I passed through AEROGREEN. I only know that I was in danger of losing my way and my mind, and I was willing to gratefully accept that happening. Ott growled. We have worse problems than moths right now, he said. Look behind us, gentlemen. They have returned with reinforcements. Above the pines in plain sight were not just 2, but 3 Garnian scout ships and 1 good-sized fighter, and they were making no attempt to hide themselves anymore. They flew at a walking pace like abominable kites. Day sucked in his breath as yet another Garnian fighter ship edged in over the treetops. There are 4 of them now. I think they might be on to us, Binder said. We can't defend ourselves against that fighter craft from the ground like this. We have no choice but continue forward, Gabriel answered. Let's move quickly. I think we should take them, Ott said. Anyone with me? Keep your weapons at hand, Gabriel continued. If they do attack, we should separate and meet again together on this side of the AEROGREEN Valley. Or if that fails, move on forward and rendezvous there at Longray Bluffs. Gabriel glanced at the hovering ships. Day, come, stay close by my side. I hear thunder again, Day said, battling at the moths in front of his face. But the skies are cloudless and the thunder does not end. It sounds as though we're marching directly into it. That's not thunder, Dreher said. Those are moth wings. All right, next part. The muddy, weedy road that they had been following eventually turned into smooth stone beneath their feet. At one time long ago, it had been an active thoroughfare between two flourishing towns long since extinct. 1,000,000 wagon wheels had farmed two smooth wheel ruts in the stone, but what cities and civilizations they had been, no one could now remember. There were no major cities within hundreds of miles of them in any direction now. Countless rains had continued the work, keeping the stone road as smooth as spotted sienna silk. The troop continued to climb as the road weaved up its sloping mountainside. Directly before them, the road divided. An ivy-covered marker of faded brown stone stood in the center of the divide, etched with an ancient script of Tiberlian letters, indiscernible to all. One route went off to their right on a long, gradual curving slope to the top. The other, to the left, zigzagged much more steeply up stones and broken steps directly up the hillside, joining the longer, easier way at the crest. The AEROGREEN had grown so thick around them that the hillside and the scrubby trees were now gray and alive with movement. Gabriel chose the steeper of the two paths, and all agreed. The stairs there were weather-beaten, old, and crumbling. Each step they took unintentionally crushed moths underfoot. The thunder from the beating wings of the AEROGREEN in the valley over the next rise was not unlike the thunder of a waterfall, mixed with the sound of a massive wind. The roar was alive. The smell, Day cried out, coughing, it's unbearable. The stairs had eroded away at one point, so Gabriel paused to boost Day up onto the next large stone. The young king stood and turned, looking back over the long valley from which they had come. Shielding his eyes, he could see the path they had taken, winding for miles, back through the trees and far beyond into the warm, hazy distance. The Guardians were now nowhere in sight, which made all of them nervous. All 6 members of the troop were weary from the road and distracted by the moths, making them ever more vulnerable to a surprise attack. As they helped to pull Gabriel up beside him, for one quick second, he thought he saw movement on the hilltop above them, just 2 small shadows beyond the veil of dead bushes and swirling moths dashing quickly across the upper corner rim of the nearby rise. He squinted. The blazing sunlight was shining directly at his eyes, but he saw nothing else. Whatever it was gone like a puff of smoke. Did you see something? Gabriel asked. I'm not sure, Day said. Shadows, I think. Something has to cast a shadow, the prince advised. They do not exist on their own. One by one, the troop climbed to the top level shelf at the head of the staircase and paused to have a drink of water, to clear their throats, and to catch their breaths. Never had their packs seemed more burdensome. Years and years' worth of accumulated dead and dying moths had accrued, piling a foot deep beneath their feet like a dry, dusty, ashy gray snow. Dreher had taken the lead, advising them to ready their ropes so that they could secure themselves to one another at the top before plunging through. AEROGREEN is right over this ridge, he called out from the summit. The rumble of the wings was incredibly loud. You can see the far side from here. That'll be 30 dillons, please, said an odd little voice from behind a dead tree. It was as sharp and clear as a bell. Day was the closest to the strange voice. He spun around and stepped quickly backwards, almost stumbling. Gabriel's hand went swiftly to his sword. From behind the gnarly tree, 2 little people stepped sprightly out, a little old man and a little old woman who matched, palms outstretched, shy eyes blinking as rapidly as the moth's wings fluttering around them. They were dressed in colorful, tattered clothing from head to foot, apricot, cream, and mint green. Both were balding, nearly toothless, and covered with gray AEROGREENs. That'll be 30 dillons, repeated the little old man. Apiece. Day smiled at them, supposing that the odd little couple were the ones who had cast the shadows he had seen just moments before while climbing up the hill. 30 dillons, Gabriel replied, drawing closer to them. For what? No closer, they piped. signaling him as they stepped nervously back. They both leaned, humped over to the left. 30 Dillons to pass, they said together, now smiling their wide, toothless smiles. Don't sneeze or you'll frighten the bookends away, Binder replied. Why should we pay to pass here? Gabriel asked. You don't own this valley, the moths do. The two elf-like characters giggled and hugged each other. Must pay to pass, great warrior man, insisted the little blushing lady. Caretakers. 30 each, times 6 of you, that's 200 Dillons even. I think your math is off, Binder replied. I'm sorry, but we have no Dillons with us today, little friends. He stepped toward them, and at once they were gone, somehow blending instantly into the moths and trees and bushes all around them. No, no, came a little scolding voice from behind them. The troop spun to find the couple standing on a tree stump on the opposite side of the small clearing. No closer, the little man said, shaking his angry finger. He stomped his foot. 30 Dillons apiece across, and 50 for each of your airboats. The troop followed the wood elf's gaze to the trees behind them, and there hovered the Garnian skycrafts. They had returned and were drawing in close. No Dillons, Gabriel reiterated. You folk have no need for man's money. You only hoard it and never spend it, and besides, those aren't our airboats. They're unwanted tag-alongs. You'll have to speak to them if you want gold or silver. He pressed past them toward the rumbling mass. Let's go. Let's get this over with. Wait, cried the elf. 20 Dillons. The others filed right on past them. Dreher was laughing. Go bother someone else, Ott growled at them as he went by. We're busy today, little man. Dave reached into his pocket and found one shiny gold Dillon, and he flipped it toward them with his thumb. It landed on the ground near their shoeless feet. They jumped on it, laughing and singing. Thank you, they said, thank you. Dave turned and ran, quickly joining the rest of the troop at the crest of the hill. What opened up there before them was beyond the grasp of reality or belief. The valley of AEROGREEN lay open at their feet, an ocean of hypnotic movement in a million shades of gray. It was an awesome, incredible theater of nature, more immense and powerful than Day or any of the rest of the troop had previously envisioned. Dave felt suddenly minute in comparison to it. I've never seen anything like this before, Percy said. Nor I, said Ott. It is a sea of life. When I passed through here before, Dreher told them, it was not a quarter of this size. I fear we've arrived at the height of their breeding season. It will be very difficult to pass. I fear we will have to be... we'll have much more trouble once we're down there inside of it. Just 10 or 15 yards ahead of them, the road at their feet disappeared completely down into the massive swarm, and then on the far side, directly across from them, barely discernible, it resurfaced again, rising from the swirling gray sea in between. However, the distance to the other side was deceiving. It could have been a quarter of a mile across. It could have been 4. The perspective continued to shift before their squinted eyes, creating an optical illusion. One thing was for certain. Beckoning green hills dotted with golden summer flowers awaited them on the distant shore of gray. To the north on their left, the forest of netted impenetrable ords closed in upon the cylindrical bowl-shaped valley. The rocks and cliffs beyond stood steep and jagged. To the south, the blue sky beckoned. It was there that the river run flowed out of the heart of AEROGREEN and left the land falling over a sheer cliff of unfathomable depths in the shadowy, sunless lands far, far below. A huge waterfall. Get your ropes, Gabriel shouted. A moth flew into his mouth and he spit it out. Secure yourselves in a straight line, one after the other. If one is lost, we're all lost. Hold tight. Cover your mouths with kerchiefs if you have them, Dreher advised. It will help you breathe. You're going to feel as if you're being smothered. Dave found himself oddly enthralled with the rippling, swirling, surfaceless waves dancing before his eyes. He began to experience a form of mild hypnosis that a flowing brook or the coals of a campfire could likewise inspire in him. Was this what Dreher had warned them about? Because it wasn't bad. It wasn't that bad at all. It was nice. He barely noticed the moths crawling about on his hands and face anymore. There are two things to remember as we cross, Dreher cried to the others. First, the moths have a natural pull to the right toward the cliffs. Remember Gabriel's story about the doomed army? Such was their demise, so avoid that pull. The moths will lead you over the edge of the cliff if they can. Overcompensate an inch to the left with every step as if fighting a wind. Secondly, remember to concentrate on the task at hand and avoid the overwhelming call of the moths. Hold on to the rope tight, because we will have no further communication with each other once we enter their domain. Stay together, breathe when you can, concentrate, veer slightly to the left. The river run was only knee-deep when I crossed it, and perhaps 20 feet from shore to shore, but it will be deeper now, what with the recent rains we went through, so take all appropriate precautions. Focus. Focus! Day, come and stay close with me, Gabriel said. Tie this loop around your wrist and hold on at all costs. He stepped toward the thunderous living mass. The rope went taut, and all followed. See you on the other side. Wait, wait, they heard from behind them as they were, one by one, enveloped by the swarm. Wait, I say! Day turned quickly, squinting through the moths at the figure dashing up the rise toward them. He waved his hand at the moths before his eyes. Who is that? He cried, stalling. He was yanked along like a dead weight. Percy disappeared into the moths, then Binder. Sire, the rope! Shouted out above the roar. He took King Day by the hand and forced the rope into it. You must hold on or be left behind, or worse. It's just the wood elves. Don't be deceived. No, it's not the wood elves, cried Day, although now no one could hear him anymore. Stop, go back, it's Deadland. Next part. Down they descended into the living insect sea. Moths immediately filled all the space around them, delving deeply into their clothes and packs. Even if it were possible to open their eyes, which it was not, the sun's light could not have penetrated the deep, dark cloud of solid gray. Deeper and deeper they submerged, the pressure of the moths against their skin increasing as they descended. I have some good news for everyone, a voice suddenly said, as clear as day. It was Percy. The moths do not seem to have an effect on me, and I am able to communicate telepathically. They were glad to hear his voice, a clear bell of sanity in a world without dimensions or conscious control. I can feel the slight pull to the right, as Dreher foretold, he said. I will remind you of his words. Do not compromise with them. Stay to the left, move slowly, one step at a time. The ascent was not smooth. It was steep and rough. They felt their way forward blindly with their feet, stepping off shelves of slimy rock and often stumbling together. There was no way to tell if they were still on the road anymore at that point, or if they had headed off the bank towards some perilous hidden chasm. The moths underfoot, alive and dead, were as soft as cotton, as fine as dust, and several feet deep. It was slow going and awkward. The smell of sweet rot and decay. Then the moths began to call to them. It was almost like a song. The soft thrum of millions and millions of moth wings that surrounded and penetrated. The troop of 6 were now totally immersed in a resonating, somber rumble, as if slowly and methodically becoming a part of it. As their bodies became one with the frequencies that spanned all audible ranges and beyond, they assimilated. Almost immediately, the effects of the strange valley began to work on them, each one responding differently to the exotic and erotic song. Gabriel's concentrated on 1 foot alone, stepping 1 foot over the other until he reached the far side. Then in one flashing moment of weakness, he briefly listened. For 1 split second, he allowed himself to experience the sensations of the tiny wings fluttering all over his body, in his clothes, on his face, in his hair, and instantly he forgot everything. His mission, his name, the rest of the troop. It was as if They had never existed. He was immediately alone and in slumbering bliss. There was a constant weight, a comforting pressure all over him. It was very peaceful and forever. He suddenly realized to his delight and astonishment that he was not even awake, but asleep at home in his bedchambers, in some other place, fast asleep and dreaming soundly. The weight upon him was nothing but his own soft down blankets and the bed surrounding him. It was a sleep so divine that it felt like love, and he chose never to wake again. "Onward!" Percy said to them all. The troop was wavering, struggling in different directions. The ground began to rise underfoot, and he wondered if they had headed backward in a circle. "To the left! Stay focused!" Dreher Freygood had long ago forgotten what the effects of his first experience in AEROGREEN had on him all those years ago, but now it returned, as if that journey had only occurred the day before. The moths were so ticklish. The tiny feather-like creatures were everywhere, on his neck, in his shirt, in his shoes, and in between his toes. It was sheer torture. It was so much more intense than his first trip through AEROGREEN. There were so many more of them. He squeezed the loop of the rope tight in his right hand, attempting to fight off the aerodares with his left, but to no avail. He laughed out loud and squirmed, and then he laughed louder, and within seconds his laughter was muffled as if he were trying to laugh with a mouthful of bread. Dave wanted to tell them all to go back, but he had forgotten why. The moths were singing to him. The beating of their wings was some kind of soothing orchestral instrument, and he was adrift on the music they made. It was not unlike the soft melody of harps or the gentle coursing of water on glass. He was flying between the world of wake and sleep, desiring only to lie down and listen for a few minutes. Could the rest of them hear the lullaby? It was so dark and lovely. "What is happening to you all?" Percy cried to them. He jerked at the rope. "Stay together! Don't veer off or we're all doomed!" Ott roared, cursed, and then he fell silent. He occasionally slashed at the sword with claws outstretched, feeling the resistance as if he were in the water. He could not fight this foe by any means that he knew, which frustrated him to the point of madness. Binder found himself leading them onward from the center of the rope, with the rest of them dangling like weights on either side of it. He could not exactly tell where he was heading, but he continued to march, foot over foot, deaf, dumb, and blind. It was dark now, with nothing but gray. Gray light through his eyelids, gray sound, gray taste, and the smell and the taste was so musty, the dust of chalk. The flavor was ashy dust. He was walking through gray stone, pulling the weight of the world behind him. Or was he part of that stone, he wondered. That was certainly it. He was, himself, part of the stone that surrounded him, and it was pointless to walk. Why attempt it? Could rocks walk? Why should they? Rocks were made to rest, firmly and solidly. Rocks were unmovable. "Take one more step," Percy cried. "One more, and another." Binder's existence in that great gray stone was of no consequence. His life existence was now trivial in the grand scheme of the universe. Rocks did not move on their own. They held things down. They weighted the earth under their feet so that it would not float away into space. They sat for eons and just slowly eroded. He had to stop now because he realized he was not alive, and in fact he had never existed at all. He was a great rock, important, strong, and heavy. Gabriel stumbled back into the lead, stepping suddenly knee-deep into the stream of AEROGREEN. It was icy cold and swift, instantly sobering him. It jarred his senses back to life for a moment, and he fought to retain them. The moths around him were at their thickest, nearly a solid mass, and it was choking the air out of him. "Keep on!" he heard Percy cry, and the voice inspired him to do so. He pulled hard at the rope, encouraging his fellow travelers onward into the stream of AEROGREEN, halfway there. "Remember, concentrate," the Mahekian cried. "Ignore the urge! Ignore! Ignore! Remember the far shore!" Binder splashed into the stream, followed by Ott. It revived them both, just enough. I'm beginning to feel strange now, Percy said. I feel so helpless, like a little child, but I do feel so happy. Ott roared. He was infuriated with his loss of control. I am happy. I'm a child again, Percy sang deliriously. He pulled against the rope as though he wanted to run off and play. Come with me! He tried to free his hand from the tight loop he had secured around his wrist. They stumbled through the water, and instantly it grew deeper. It was remarkably cold and biting, ice water from the mountain snows, and it was running swiftly. They suddenly realized their peril as it rose up higher on them with every step that they took. Hold on, Percy called. The bottom is slick. The AEROGREEN larva is as slick as snails. Dave was up to his hips, and he was having trouble keeping his footing. Gabriel, I'm slipping. He stumbled and slid over and over again, grasping desperately onto Ott's belt for support. His pack came loose and drifted away with the torrents. The Thordian was growling with every struggling breath he was able to take. Binder was the first to fall and go under. He held onto the rope with one hand while grappling at larva-covered boulders under the surface with the other. Binder fell in, Percy cried. Help him up. Commander Binder's under the water. Hold on to Day, Gabriel cried out, pulling his hand free from the knotted loop, but he could say nothing further. He traversed down the rope, hand over hand, past Percy, and seized Binder's wrist beneath the water, pulling on him with all his might. The rapids pushed hard against him, but he was somehow able to keep his footing. Binder found a foothold and stood, momentarily crying out before his mouth was filled with moths. Come on, Percy cried. Let's cross it. We're halfway there. We can make it. Don't stop now. Don't give up. We're halfway across. With all his strength and concentration, Gabriel moved back down the rope to find Day, grasping onto each of his comrades for support along the way. Even if he had to carry the boy to the far shore on his shoulders, his only thought now was to get young King Day up and out of that hellish nightmare as soon as was possible. The rest of the troop would just have to fend for themselves now. They were all moving again, step by step, making good progress across the stream of AEROGREEN, when suddenly Binder slipped and fell in again, coming free of the rope and drug Ott off along with him. Then they heard Day cry out, Gabriel! And he too was gone beneath the raging waters with them. Something's wrong, Percy said, holding on to a limp rope. They've fallen in! Go on, Gabriel cried out to Dreher and Percy, and then he dove blindly and without thought into the swift, icy water, allowing the current to pull him along with it. He stretched out his arms and legs, feeling for the sides or the bottom. His hands slid through the squirming aquatic caterpillar larva like oil on mud. He scraped his shoulder against a sharp rock, unable to cry out. The current was carrying him faster and faster. He swam with it, stretching his hands out in front of him, hoping to seize the boy or anyone floating along ahead of him. If only he could catch hold of Day and pull him to the side. He could not rise for a breath, no matter how badly he needed one, nor open his eyes underwater. It was too dark and murky to see. He tried one last time to swim ahead, but the current tossed him from side to side. His head hit a rock, sending flashes of sparkling white spots before his clenched eyes. He was sucked mercilessly along, unable to control his movement, desperately needing to take a breath. He reached for the side, for the bottom, for anything, but there was nothing there. He could not tell which direction was up, down, left, or right anymore. He realized he was floating downstream backwards now. Any second he half expected vertigo to hit as he shot out over the massive waterfalls and off into the oblivion of death. The thunder was coming just ahead. It thrummed in his aching ears. He screamed under the water and tensed all of his muscles in preparation for the launch. His hand touched something in the water, and he seized it as fast as a snake striking its prey. It was a shirt cloth. He pulled and clenched onto an arm. He could tell It was young King Day. Suddenly, Gabriel himself was caught by someone, seizing him by his hair and collar, yanking him to a stop. He felt the water pull hard against him as he swung around and crashed to a halt into the rocks at the side of the stream. Another hand seized him about the wrist. His face rose above the surface, and he sucked in as much air as he could between his clenched teeth, spitting out the omnipresent moths, clinging precariously to a greasy, slimy rock, with Day choking at his bosom. Someone still held him by his hair, and they yanked him up and out of the stream with struggling effort, pulling the boy up along with him. Another hand, a stronger one, seized his belt and lifted him up and out of the river. Gabriel thought that it was Binder, but he could not be sure. He tried to speak, but he could not. In fact, he felt as though he were smothering to death. The boy encircled his arms around Gabriel's waist. They were on solid ground again at least, but on which shore he was unsure. He was so weak that he nearly faltered to his knees several times. He felt a loop go around his wrist, and it jerked him forward. Exhausted, confused, and in shock, Gabriel came to his feet and began to follow whoever it was who had saved him. At that point, he didn't care who it was. He just wanted out of that hell. Once again, the moths began calling to him. "Shut up!" he cried to them. He tried to ignore them, but even his anger and fear of disgrace did not aid him while passing through the great domain of the gray aerodares. Down there in their valley, the insects ruled, not him, nor any man. In another few seconds, he was hypnotized again, dreamily and blissfully sleepwalking again under the powerful spell of the horrible moths of AEROGREEN, without a single care left in the world. Fortunately for him this time, his wrists were securely tied and someone else was now in control. And that is the end of Chapter 7. The next chapter, Chapter 8, is called The Wizard Story. We'll get to that next.